deep in the back of a bustling RSPCA shelter. Past the chorus of hopeful barks and pleading eyes, a lone Akita sat in silence. His coat, which might have once shone like burnished gold, was now a dull, matted mess, and his deep amber eyes held a quiet, settled grief. Months had passed since he'd arrived. Overlooked, unwanted, he was no longer a playful pup, and the past had carved deep lines into both his body and his spirit. Then, one day, a woman walked through the doors, and in that moment, everything changed. What began as a simple adoption would unfold into an incredible story. This dog wasn't just being rescued, he was destined to save a life, and the actions he would later take would stun a community, proving that sometimes, the greatest heroes walk on four paws. The air hung thick with the smell of damp concrete and disinfectant. The overcrowded shelter echoed with the sound of dogs, each one desperately trying to catch an eye, to be the one chosen for a second chance. But amidst the chaos, one dog sat perfectly still at the very back of his enclosure. An Akita they called Rusty. His once golden fur was tangled and patchy, revealing the sharp lines of his ribs beneath. His ears, which should have stood proud and alert, drooped slightly, as if weighed down by the years. His deep brown eyes held nothing but a profound emptiness. He had given up. Months had passed since Rusty had been rescued from a property on the edge of the bushlands. He'd spent most of his life on a chain, exposed to the blistering summer sun and the biting winter nights. The faint, silvery scars on his body told a story of a past he couldn't escape. Every person who visited the shelter glanced his way and kept walking. No one wanted a broken-down Akita huddled in the corner. But then, one day, everything changed. Grace Connolly pushed open the shelter door, the soles of her Blundstone boots making a soft sound on the tiled floor. She'd been here before, but this time felt different. It wasn't just to drop off supplies or check on a case. She had a purpose. At 38, Grace, a volunteer for the State Emergency Service, had seen too much loss. Her role meant facing tragedy head-on, road accidents, floodwaters, search parties, but nothing had prepared her for the grief of losing Max. Her old Australian shepherd. Max had been her partner, her shadow. When he was gone, a part of Grace had gone with him. Friends suggested she get a new dog, but she'd always refused. "You can't replace family," she'd say. But today, as she walked past the enclosures, something made her stop, and then she saw him. Rusty. Grace paused in front of his run. Unlike the other dogs, who jumped and barked and wagged their tails with frantic hope, Rusty didn't move a muscle. He simply lifted his head slowly and met her gaze with those deep, amber eyes. They were clouded, exhausted, as if he had already accepted his fate. Grace knelt down, carefully pushing her fingers through the chain-link fence. "Hey there, mate," she whispered. Rusty didn't respond. "I'm Grace. Looks like we've both got a few battle scars." After a long silence, a flicker of something appeared in Rusty's eyes. It was almost imperceptible, a faint light in the darkness. But it was there. "I wouldn't bother with that one, love," a voice interrupted. A young shelter worker named Jenna approached, wiping her hands on a towel. "He's been here for months. Shows no interest in people. Doesn't trust them. We heard he came from a family that, well, they lost everything in the fires last season. Had to surrender him. He's a tough case." Grace didn't take her eyes off Rusty. "Has anyone tried?" Jenna hesitated. "A few, but he won't engage, won't even take a treat. He's just shut down." Grace nodded, her fingers still resting on the cool metal of the enclosure. "I know the feeling," she murmured. Then, she stood up. "I'll take him." The paperwork was done. Grace stood just outside the shelter, holding the lead of a dog who seemed utterly indifferent. Rusty just stood there, staring out at the car park. No excitement, no tail wag, just a hollow stillness. Grace knelt beside him, her grip firm on the lead. "I don't know what you've been through, Rusty," she whispered, "but I can promise you this. You're safe now." There was no reaction. With a sigh, Grace stood and opened the door to her ute. Rusty hesitated. For the first time, Grace saw a flash of doubt in his eyes, not fear, but suspicion, as if he'd been promised safety before, and it had been a lie. Grace didn't rush him. She waited, and after what felt like an eternity, Rusty took a step forward. Just one. He placed a paw inside the vehicle, then another, and another, until finally, he was in. Grace let out a breath she didn't know she was holding and closed the door. As she pulled out of the car park, she glanced in the rearview mirror. Rusty was sitting quietly, watching through the window as the shelter disappeared behind them. Neither of them could have known that this wasn't just the day Rusty was rescued. It was the day everything would change. The drive home was wrapped in silence. Rusty sat in the passenger footwell, his thin frame taking up almost no space. He didn't move, didn't whine, didn't even glance at Grace. He just stared out the window, watching the landscape of the Adelaide Hills roll by. Grace had seen plenty of scared dogs in her time with the Says. But Rusty was different. There was no panic, no aggression, just a void, the look of a dog who had simply stopped believing in people. She guided the ute up the gravel driveway to her small house. A quiet, safe place nestled amongst gum trees. It was a world away from the hell Rusty must have known. Opening the passenger door, Grace gently tugged the lead. "Come on, mate, we're home." Rusty hesitated again. His paws remained planted on the floor of the ute, his eyes scanning the space outside, as if suspecting this was just another trap. Grace knelt beside him, her voice low. "No one's going to hurt you here. You're safe." Rusty's ears twitched. He paused, then placed one paw on the ground, then the other. He stood outside, sniffing the air, which was rich with the scent of eucalyptus. Grace watched him carefully. Was this place just another temporary stop before he was abandoned again? He didn't head towards the house. Instead, he stood beside the ute, staring down the driveway as if waiting for someone else to arrive and collect him. Grace swallowed hard and gave the lead a gentle tug. "Inside, Rusty." The moment he stepped inside, Rusty froze. His eyes darted around the room, the sofa, the timber floors, the warm lighting. It was too quiet, too normal. No metal cages, no barking, no harsh fluorescent lights. Grace unclipped the lead, giving him space. "Take your time, mate." Rusty took a step forward, his claws making a soft clicking sound on the floorboards. Then another, but then he stopped. His nose twitched, his ears pricked up, and he bolted towards the back door. Grace's heart tightened. He wasn't exploring, he was looking for an escape route. The dog pressed his nose against the glass, his breathing shallow. Grace didn't move. She just stood there, waiting for him to figure it out. Slowly, Rusty turned his head, not to look at her, but towards the window, as if memorizing an alternative exit, just in case. The first night was the hardest. Grace set out a soft dog bed in the living room, but Rusty wouldn't touch it. Instead, he curled up near the front door, staring at it for hours. Grace sat on the sofa, watching him quietly. He wasn't resting, wasn't sleeping. He was waiting for the door to open, for someone or something to come and take him away again. The sight of it made her stomach clench. She sighed, rubbing her face with her hands. He still didn't trust her. And why should he? Trust wasn't given, it was earned, and Grace was starting from scratch. The next morning, Grace woke early, careful not to startle him. The dog hadn't moved all night. He was still curled in a tight, tense ball by the door. Grace took the bag of dog food and poured a small amount into a bowl. She placed it a few meters away from him and backed away. "Here you go, Rusty." Rusty didn't move, he just stared. Minutes passed. Grace sighed and sat at her kitchen table, scrolling through her phone to pass the time. Then, she heard a faint noise. Looking up, she saw Rusty inching forward, sniffing the food. He hesitated, then took a single, tentative bite. Grace let out a soft breath. It was a small thing, but it was a start. Later that afternoon, Grace tried something new. She pulled an old tennis ball from a drawer and rolled it across the floor. It wasn't a command, just a quiet invitation. Rusty's ears twitched, his eyes following the ball as it rolled to a stop. But he didn't chase it. Grace managed a small smile. Of course not. But then, something unexpected happened. While he hadn't chased the ball, the look in his eyes, though still wary, seemed to soften just a fraction. It was a tiny, meaningful shift. For now, that was enough. That evening, Grace stretched out on the sofa, rubbing her tired eyes. She'd left the dog bed out again. And just like the night before, Rusty curled up by the door. But this time, something was different. He wasn't just staring at the door. He was also glancing over at her. The glances were fleeting, almost unnoticeable, but Grace saw them, and for the first time, she allowed herself to believe. Maybe, just maybe, this was going to work. That Rusty wasn't just in another temporary house. That he was home. The days passed quietly. Rusty still kept his distance. Never fully relaxing, never letting his guard down. He ate his food, but only when Grace wasn't looking. He moved through the house, but only when he thought he was unobserved. His only real moments of activity were when he'd pace by the door, staring out as if waiting for someone. Grace knew this wouldn't be easy. Rescuing a dog wasn't just about bringing them home. It was about teaching them that the home was real. One evening, as Grace was making a sandwich in the kitchen, she heard a sound behind her. Rusty was standing in the doorway. Grace froze. He had never come this close before. He was always by the front door, a distant observer with a clear escape route. But now, he was in the kitchen. Grace turned slowly, careful not to make any sudden moves. "Hey there, mate," she said softly. Rusty's ears twitched, his eyes flicking between Grace and the food on the counter. Grace gave a faint smile. "Feeling a bit hungry?" Rusty tensed. Grace tore a piece of ham from her sandwich and held it out. She didn't move closer, just extended her hand, leaving the choice entirely up to him. The dog stared at it for what felt like a lifetime. Then, slowly, with careful, deliberate steps, he moved forward. 1 step, 2. Grace held her breath. Rusty stretched out his neck, sniffed the ham, and then gently took it from her fingers. It was the first time he had taken food directly from a human hand. Grace stayed still, watching him chew, studying his expression. He looked anxious, as if expecting something bad to happen next. But nothing did. Grace just smiled. "Good boy, Rusty." He swallowed, then backed away, returning to his usual spot near the door. It wasn't a huge leap, but it was progress. That night, Grace sat on the sofa, flipping through an old photo album. The pages were filled with pictures of Max, the day she brought him home. Their hikes through the bush, training sessions, and the last photo they took together before he passed. The one thing Grace could never get used to was the silence. Max had always been there, following her from room to room, his tail thumping against the furniture. The house had never felt so empty. She sighed, closing the album. As she glanced towards the front door, she saw something that made her catch her breath. Rusty had moved. He wasn't curled up by the door. He was closer, not right next to her, but closer than he'd ever been. His eyes met hers for a brief second before he looked away. But Grace saw it, the hesitation, the uncertainty, and for the first time, she felt that maybe Rusty wasn't just waiting to leave. Maybe he was starting to think about staying. Grace woke to the quiet sound of paws on the timber floor. For a second, she thought she'd imagined it. She blinked in the dim morning light filtering through the curtains, trying to shake off the fog of sleep. Then she heard it again. Slow, cautious, hesitant. Rusty was moving. As Grace turned her head, she saw a shadow pass by the end of the sofa. She held her breath. Rusty was no longer by the door. Instead, he was standing in the hallway, looking towards her bedroom. Grace watched, motionless. Rusty's posture was stiff. His ears pricked at every sound. But he was deeper inside the house. He wasn't just existing anymore. This meant something. Careful not to startle him, Grace shifted slightly. "Morning, mate." Rusty's eyes flicked over his shoulder towards her. There was a pause, and then, without a sound, he turned and padded back to his usual spot by the door. Grace let out a long breath, covering her face with her hands. He was watching her now, observing, testing. Maybe, just maybe, he was starting to believe this wasn't just another stop along the way. Later that afternoon, Grace sat on the back veranda, sipping a cuppa. The sun was high, casting a golden light over the garden. The smell of damp earth and eucalyptus from the previous night's rain hung in the air. Rusty was lying a few meters away, stretched out in the shade of the railing. His golden coat hadn't fully regained its shine, and his body was still tense, poised to run, but he wasn't hiding. He was choosing to be near her. That was progress. Grace took another sip of her tea and looked out towards the trees. "Ever been for a proper walk in the bush, Rusty?" His ears twitched, but he didn't move. Grace smiled. "Probably not." An idea formed in her mind. It might be too soon. He might not be ready. But something told her to try. That afternoon, Grace took an old lead from a hook in the closet and held it up. "What do you think, mate?" From his spot by the door, Rusty lifted his head slightly. Grace knelt down, keeping her voice calm. "Wanna go for a walk?" Rusty's eyes moved from the lead to the door. Grace could almost see the conflict playing out in his mind. A walk meant outside, open spaces, freedom. But for Rusty, freedom had never meant safety. Grace didn't push. She just held the lead and waited. Minutes passed, and then there was a slow, uncertain movement. Rusty stood up. Grace felt her chest tighten. She clipped the lead to his collar, her fingers brushing against the coarse golden fur. Then, with a patience only time can teach, she opened the door. For a moment, Rusty froze, his body rigid, his breathing shallow. Then, slowly, he took a step outside. One step, then another. Grace swallowed. This wasn't just a walk. This was the first time Rusty was leaving a place without being forced. And that meant everything. The bush was quiet, filled only with the sound of the wind rustling the gum leaves and the call of a distant kookaburra. Grace kept a slow pace, holding the lead loosely. She didn't force Rusty to follow, letting him explore at his own speed. He kept his head low, nose twitching as he sniffed the dirt track. His tail was still tucked low, his muscles tense, but he wasn't trying to bolt. It was strange. watching him move like a ghost, his steps careful and calculated, as if he was still waiting for something bad to happen. Grace breathed out softly, one day at a time. They walked for a while, a silent conversation passing between them. Then something shifted. A sudden gust of wind swept through the trees, rattling the branches overhead. The sound startled Rusty. His body went tense, his ears pinned back, and for the very first time, he took a step towards Grace. Not to run past her, but because she had become the safest thing in his world. Grace didn't react immediately. She just let the moment hang in the air. Then, finally, she knelt and gently stroked his golden fur. For the first time, Rusty didn't flinch away. He just stood there, allowing her hand to rest on him. For Grace, it meant more than any words. Rusty had taken his first step towards trust. And for the first time, Grace truly believed. Maybe he wasn't just waiting for a way out. Maybe he was starting to believe in home. The house had changed. It was in small, subtle ways that most people wouldn't notice. Rusty still slept near the door, and he still startled at sudden movements. But he would linger near Grace for a little longer now. He didn't bolt at every strange noise. And the tail that was always curled tight would sometimes loosen just a fraction when he heard her voice. Progress was slow, but it was there. Grace didn't rush him. Trust wasn't given, it was built, and Rusty was still learning how to believe in something again. One evening, Grace was in the kitchen, fixing a leaky pipe under the sink. Tools were scattered on the floor, and a cabinet door hung open. Rusty lay a few meters away, his eyes half closed but still watchful. Grace looked over at him and smiled. "Are you going to help? Or just supervise?" Rusty didn't move. Grace chuckled and shook her head. "Thought so." She reached for a wrench, adjusting a fitting on the pipe. The moment she turned it, there was a sharp, loud pop, followed by a hiss of steam. A high-pressure valve had failed, and scalding water erupted from the pipe. The force knocked Grace backwards, her shoulder slamming into the cabinet. Pain shot through her instantly. The hot steam seared her skin, and the floor was immediately slick with boiling water. Grace tried to scramble up, but her foot slipped and she went down hard on her back, a sharp pain lancing through her ribs. For a moment, everything was a blur. She could hear the hissing pipe, the water spreading across the floor, and then another sound, a low, deep growl. Grace blinked, her head swimming. Rusty was standing over her. His body was tense, his ears slightly flattened, the fur on his back raised. His tail was rigid, not from fear, but from defiance. Before Grace could process what was happening, Rusty moved. He darted through the puddle of steaming water, his paws slipping slightly on the wet floor. He reached the doorway and disappeared. Grace groaned, trying to move. Her arm was on fire. Her head throbbed. Then she heard it, a bark. It came from another room. Grace gritted her teeth. In all the time he'd been here, Rusty had never barked, not once. Something was wrong. She used the cabinet to haul herself up, her body screaming in protest, her skin still prickling with heat. And then she saw it. Smoke. Her heart stopped. Black smoke was billowing from the hallway, growing thicker by the second, and Rusty was barking at the smoke. Grace's training kicked in before her mind could catch up. She grabbed a tea towel, held it to her mouth, and staggered into the hallway. The air was hot and heavy, the acrid smell of burning plastic filling her lungs. Through the haze, she saw it. Sparks were spitting from a power outlet near the living room, a small electrical fire that was already licking its way up the wall towards the curtains. And standing between her and the door was Rusty. His golden fur was bristled, his body rigid, his tail held high in a posture of defense. Grace's chest seized. He wasn't running, he was holding his ground. Grace dropped to her knees, ignoring the pain, ignoring the heat from her burns. "Rusty, come." But the dog didn't move. His body was blocking the path to the door, as if challenging the flames to come closer. Grace coughed, the thick smoke making her eyes water. There was no time to think. They had to get out. She took a deep breath, her voice firm. "Rusty, let's go, now." Another bark, but this time, Rusty took a step back, then another, and another, until finally, he turned and ran towards her. The second he was close enough, Grace grabbed his collar and pushed him forward. "Go!" The flames roared behind them, the heat licking at their backs. And then, cold air, they were outside. Grace collapsed onto the gravel driveway, coughing violently. The cool night air was a stark contrast to the heat inside. Rusty stood beside her, panting, his chest rising and falling rapidly. For the first time, Grace saw fear in his eyes, not the quiet, resigned fear from before, but something else, the fear of losing something. She reached out, her fingers gently brushing through his golden fur. "It's okay, mate," she said, her voice hoarse. "We're okay." Rusty's ears twitched. His tail, usually tucked tight, was now slightly relaxed, and for a fleeting moment, it gave a soft, gentle sway. It wasn't a happy wag. It was a deep, quiet confirmation, an unspoken promise. The house smelled of smoke. The fire had been small enough for Grace to extinguish once they were safely outside. But the damage was done, a scorched wall, melted wiring, and the lingering stench of burnt plastic. It would take days to clean up, but none of that mattered. He had saved her life. Grace sat on the sofa, an ice pack pressed to her burnt arm. The skin where the steam had hit was tender and red, but she barely felt the pain. Her mind was replaying the moments in the kitchen, the burst of hot water, the flames in the hall, and Rusty, standing between her and the danger. Rusty lay on the floor nearby, his head on his paws. His breathing was calm, but his eyes were open, watching Grace with a new kind of vigilance. For the first time, it felt like he wasn't watching for an escape route, but to make sure she was okay. Grace smiled faintly. "You were supposed to be the one getting rescued, mate." Rusty didn't respond, but Grace could have sworn she saw his ears twitch, as if he was really listening. That was new, that was different, that was everything. The next morning, Grace woke to a sound she had never heard before. Paws on the floorboards, not pacing, not searching for a door, just moving. Grace sat up slowly. Rusty was standing in the hallway. His tail was down, but not tucked, his posture more relaxed than she had ever seen it. And then he did something he had never done before. He walked towards her. It wasn't a hesitant approach or a cautious glance. Rusty walked right up to her. Ears pricked, nose twitching. Grace held her breath, not wanting to do anything that might break the spell. He stopped beside the sofa, his dark eyes looking at her face, then down to the bandage on her burnt arm. And then he did it. Rusty lowered his head and gently leaned against her legs. Grace felt a lump form in her throat. It wasn't a big gesture, but from this dog, it was everything. Slowly, she raised her hand and gently stroked the Akita's head. He didn't pull away, he leaned into it. For the first time, Grace wasn't just the woman who brought him home. She wasn't the next temporary stop in his life. She was his person, and Rusty had finally decided to stay. Late that afternoon, Grace sat on the veranda, a mug of tea in her hands, watching the sky turn a warm gold. Rusty lay beside her, stretched out on the timber deck. His golden coat seemed smoother now. He was still not the kind of dog to wag his tail and jump with excitement at every little thing. But he was different. He wasn't huddled in a corner, or staring intently at the door, waiting for it to open. He was here, present, a quiet, solid presence. Grace put down her mug, her eyes falling on the old tennis ball that lay near the steps. She picked it up, rolling it gently in her palm. She knew Rusty wouldn't chase it. The last time she'd tried, the Akita had barely given it a glance. But still, something told her to try again. Grace tossed the ball a few meters away. Rusty's ears pricked up, his eyes following its movement. And for the first time, he stood up. Grace held her breath. Rusty cautiously walked a few steps forward. And then, without hesitation, he picked up the ball. Not with playfulness, not with a burst of excitement, but with purpose and seriousness. He turned, walked back to Grace, and placed the ball at her feet. Grace stared in disbelief, and then she started to laugh. A real, genuine laugh of relief. "Good boy," she whispered. "Good boy, Rusty." And this time, when Grace reached down to scratch him behind the ears, Rusty leaned into the touch. The world outside hadn't changed. Not in any grand, dramatic way. The gum trees swayed to the same rhythm. The sun still cast a golden light on the house, and the wind still carried the scent of damp earth after an evening rain. But inside this house, everything was different. Rusty was different. Grace was on the sofa, flipping through a book, but her mind wasn't really on the words. Her attention was on the sound of soft, steady breathing beside her. Rusty was stretched out on the floor, his head resting casually on her feet. Not by the door, not in a corner, but here, with her. Grace could hardly remember when it had happened. When he'd stopped keeping his distance. When he'd stopped flinching at every little thing. When he'd finally started to believe that this wasn't just another temporary stop. He had stayed, and that meant more than anything. One morning, Grace woke to a strange sensation. Warmth. For a second, she was confused. Then, as her eyes adjusted to the early morning sunlight, she saw him. Rusty was curled up not by the door, not on the floor, but beside her bed, his golden fur radiating a gentle warmth. Grace's chest tightened. She had never asked him to sleep there, never invited him to come closer. He had chosen it, and that choice, it meant more than any words. As Grace shifted slightly, Rusty's ears twitched, his eyes opened just a crack, still cloudy with sleep, as if checking to make sure she was still there. There was a pause, a soft sigh, and he closed his eyes again. Grace smiled. He finally felt safe. A few weeks later, Grace took the lead from its hook near the door. "Ready to go, mate?" Rusty's ears stood to attention, his head tilting slightly. Grace grinned. "I'll take that as a yes." She had taken him in the ute before, but they were always quiet, uncertain drives. This time was different. Rusty hopped into the vehicle without hesitation. Grace drove with the window rolled down a little, letting the breeze rush in. And then Rusty did something she had never seen before. He stuck his head out the window, his ears flapping in the wind, his nose twitching as he took in the smells of the world. And his tail, which was usually held in a tight, cautious curl, was now loose, swaying gently. It was a sign of deep contentment. Grace couldn't help but smile. She reached over and patted his head. "Yeah," she murmured, "I think we're going to be okay." And this time, when Grace reached down to scratch him behind the ears, Rusty leaned into the touch. Because this time, he wasn't just surviving, he was finally home. And a year later, he was more than that. He was a partner. After months of dedicated training, Rusty, the quiet survivor, was now a fully certified search and rescue dog with the SES. Grace now looked at him not just as the dog she had saved, but as her teammate, the one who would bravely follow her into any danger, a steadfast hero who had found his true purpose by her side. Their story proved that sometimes, the ones we set out to rescue end up rescuing us right back. If this story touched your heart, please subscribe, like, and share it with those who believe in second chances. Because every dog deserves a warm home, and every home deserves a loyal friend.